For years, men were disappearing from a part of Toronto called the Gay Village. Some were immigrants, some were refugees, some were South Asian or Middle Eastern men living complicated private lives in a city that was supposed to offer them freedom. They moved through bars, dating apps, friendships, and chosen families, until one by one, they seemed to vanish. At first, there were rumours. Then there was fear. People in the community warned each other that something was wrong, that someone was targeting men who were already easy for the world to overlook. But the warnings were dismissed for far too long. This is the story of how the city's most vulnerable men went missing in plain sight, and how the truth, when it finally came out, exposed a killer more ordinary than the men who walk beside you every day. This is the story of Bruce McArthur. Hi everyone, welcome to the Desi Crime Podcast, a show where we dive deep into some of the craziest stories from around South Asia. I'm your host Aryan.
And I'm Ishwarya.
And the case that we have for you today is one that somehow has escaped the annals of true crime history.
Aryan, escaped means truly escaped the annals, because usually you're on this side telling me you haven't heard a case. I'm usually the true crime fanatic who has. And this is a serial killer alive today that I've never heard of.
Yeah. Serial killer cases are very interesting in the way of human psychology. But in India, the ones that we have in our country are usually exhausted in terms of the coverage that has already been done on them. Recently, we did Ripachandran, but there are so many more, right? This is one that I went out looking, hoping to uncover a case that wasn't covered. And while it is not technically a South Asian serial killer, it is one that targeted South Asian and other Middle Eastern communities that somehow we don't even know about.
Has evaded all of us.
But before I dive into Bruce McArthur's case, I just want to give a shout out to Aishwarya's exclusive episodes on Patreon or YouTube membership, where you are covering some of the craziest cases, not from South Asia, but from around the world.
That's right. For all of you who are members, who have a little bit of spare change lying around to help keep the engines running at Desi Crime, I give you all an exclusive episode of Desi Crime every month. And it's not technically Desi Crime. I bring you the wildest stories from across the world. And our community there really, really enjoys that little bit of extra fix.
So go join that community. Enjoy that extra fix. But with that, on with the case for today. There is a slice of downtown Toronto, maybe 6 blocks, that runs along Church Street and crosses Wellesley. And for as long as anyone alive can remember, the people who live there have called it simply the Village. And it is one of those neighborhoods that gets the mark of being a gay neighborhood. Now, this is very common in American and North American cities, where a part of that city ends up being dominated by gay people because they ended up finding a community there back in the 60s and 70s. This is common for New York, and just like New York, it's common for Toronto. This village ended up being known as the Gay Village for that very reason. On a summer night, the bars spill light and music onto the sidewalk. The patios fill up by 10 p.m. The air smells like beer and smoke and possibility. The village is what cities build when they build them right. A few square blocks where the men who have been chased out of small towns and immigrant households and entire countries can finally take a breath. For the people who walk into the village, it is supposed to be a refuge. But between the autumn of 2010 and the summer of 2017, this safe space became a hunting ground. I want you to feel those 7 years before I give you any names. Because the things the police missed, the thing the city missed, and the thing that lets a story like this happen anywhere on earth is the silence. Men were walking into the village and then they were not walking out. Not once, not twice, over and over and over again. Brown men mostly, gay men almost always, immigrants from Sri Lanka and Afghanistan and Iran and Turkey, men with double lives, men who slept in shelters, men whose families were on other continents, Men who had paid for a one-way ticket out of a war zone or out of a closet or out of a marriage and were trying quietly to build something new in a cold and unfamiliar city. And one by one, in ones and twos and threes across the year, they were just disappearing. And the disappearances were noticed by a friend who couldn't reach somebody for a week, by a roommate coming home to an apartment that clearly hadn't been slept in, by a regular at the bar realizing 6 weeks in that a familiar face hadn't been around in a while. The village is small enough that people notice. And so people, once they notice, they start to talk. And in those conversations, slowly, the dread of a community that suspects it is being preyed upon began to settle. They said it to each other first. They said it openly. They said, our people are disappearing. They said it to the bartenders, the local queer press, the police. And the police said something close to this. Gay men come and go. Immigrants come and go. People in your community, sir, slip in and out of contact for all sorts of reasons. The man you're looking for is probably in Montreal. He's probably back into the closet. He's probably with a new boyfriend. Or he's just embarrassed. But he'll turn up. Except he didn't turn up. Neither did the next one or the one after. By the time the streets finally stopped emptying, 8 men were dead. And while these victims were noticed, the assailant was unnoticed. He found a comfortable rhythm in his modus operandi of murder. And the day the mask from him was finally lifted, he was merely minutes away from beginning on a 9th potential victim. But years before the police understood what was happening on the streets they were policing, the killer understood those streets perfectly. He understood the suburban husband who slipped downtown after work and slipped back home before bed. He understood the refugee whose paperwork was thin and whose deepest instinct was to stay invisible to the state. He understood the homeless man in the shelter system, the addict on the methadone line. He understood, in other words, who in his city was unwatched. And he chose precisely them. The first of these vanished was a man named Skandaraj Navaratnam. Everyone called him Skanda. He was 40 years old, Sri Lankan, a Tamil from the island's embattled minority, and he had come to Canada as a refugee in his 20s to escape war. Back home, before the war made the country unlivable, he had worked as a hotel animator, the person whose entire job is to make a room full of strangers feel like they're having the best week of their lives. And Skanda was, by every account, exceptionally good at it. Charming, quick, funny, the kind of person a room got brighter around. On the last weekend of summer 2010, Skanda was at a bar in the village called Zippers, having what looked like a normal night. Sometime that night, he walked out of the bar with a man nobody could quite identify into streets he had walked 100 times before. But this time, he was never seen alive again. He was not reported missing that night. He was not reported missing the next day. It took 10 days before a close friend named Kevin Nash finally went to the police and said, "Something is wrong. My friend is gone." A year before Skanda disappeared, that same friend had run into him at a bathhouse, somewhere Skanda wouldn't normally be unless he was hiding from someone. Nash pulled him aside and asked him what was going on. Skanda looked frightened. He told Nash quietly that he was scared of a man he had been seeing, an older man, a controlling man with a violent streak. Nash gave him a phone number and said, "Call me if you ever need me." Skanda never called in relation to this. But now with him missing, Nash couldn't help but think back at that day and couldn't help but go to the police. But little did anyone know, if Skanda was the first, he wasn't going to be the last. He was joined 3.5 months later by a 42-year-old Afghan named Abdul Basir Faizi. Basir lived in the Brampton suburbs with his wife in a tidy house, in a tidy life. But Basir's wife did not know that her husband was gay. His family did not know either. He had built one of those partitioned lives so many of us in South Asian families know exist, whether we say it out loud or not. And the village was the half of his life where he felt he was allowed to be honest, his safe space, as you may say. But on the 29th of December 2010, deep in that dead week between Christmas and New Year, Basir pointed his car east into downtown instead of west towards home. He made his final credit card purchase and stepped out onto that street that was his home, at least the one that felt like home. His car was found later abandoned. His wife reported him missing to the suburban police force in Brampton, who did not know about the village or her husband frequenting it. Basir was joined again, almost 2 years after that, by a 58-year-old Afghan named Majid Kayan. Hamid, his friends used to call him. He was an older gentleman, quieter. He lived in a small downtown apartment a 5-minute walk from where Skanda had once lived. He was the kind of presence the bartenders nodded at without having to ask, the kind of presence you only really notice when it stops being there. And in the middle of October 2012, Hamid stopped being there. By this point, the police could no longer pretend they hadn't been told. 3 men by then had vanished from the same handful of blocks in the space of 2 years. Skanda, Basir, Hamid. All gay, all immigrants from South Asia or Central Asia, all connected to the village. Whatever else can be said about the Toronto police in this period, this is true. A small group of officers inside it did eventually look at those 3 files lying side by side and write down the right sentence. This is a serious concern. And in November of 2012, they launched a task force. They called it Project Houston. It ran for nearly 18 months. On paper, it was real work. They obtained phone records and bank records. They sent K9 units into parks and ravines. They canvassed the community. They went deep into the dating sites these 3 men had used. Websites like Silver Daddies, that niche corner of the internet where older and larger men met the people who maybe wanted them. They chased any and all tips, including at one point a tip that one of the missing men might have fallen victim to a man trading cannibalism fantasies online. They wondered briefly about another Canadian killer entirely, but despite all this work, none of it led anywhere they could hold on to. No bodies turned up, no CCTV with new movements turned up, and so, in April of 2014, after 18 months, Project Houston was quietly closed. The officers running it concluded that nothing they had found rose to the level of making anyone a criminal suspect. But 3 men had gone, while their file had simply slid into a corner, while a warm man walking around town, letting nobody see he was a cold-blooded murderer, lurked the streets. And so, more men kept vanishing. There was Surush Mahmoodi, a 50-year-old Iranian whose file would be tagged low priority and slid into a drawer. Police officers wouldn't even bother to connect him to the village until much, much later. Then there was a 37-year-old man named Kirushna Kumar Kangaratnam. And Kirushna is somebody I have to tell you about properly, because everything else in this case is about what the word unwatched really means, and Kirushna was truly unwatched. Kirushna was a Tamil from a small island called Nayanativu off the northern tip of Sri Lanka, where he had survived a civil war that killed one of his brothers. In 2010, this man climbed onto a ship called the MV Sunsea to escape precisely those circumstances. The Sunsea was a rusted, overcrowded cargo vessel that dragged itself across the Pacific for 3 months, carrying close to 500 desperate Tamil asylum seekers. And when it finally limped into a port in British Columbia, almost everyone on it was detained on arrival. Kirushna was among them. He had crossed the entire world on a prayer and a leaking ship. He had survived a war and an ocean and the suspicion of the country he was begging for safety in. And then his refugee claim was denied. By 2015, he was living quietly in the Toronto suburb of Scarborough, hiding from immigration authorities, terrified of being put back on a plane to the very nightmare he had spent his whole life trying to escape. Sometime that autumn, he too vanished. And nobody reported this man missing. Because the people who loved him were on the other side of the planet. And the people who were near him knew that walking into a police station was to risk being put back on the very same plane. By the spring of 2017, 7 years into a pattern the city had spent 7 years not seeing, the killer was operating with the easy confidence of a man who had been allowed to operate. At some point that year, a 47-year-old man named Dean Lisovic, the only one of the men taken who was not an immigrant, was also taken. Dean was homeless. He had no fixed address. He moved between shelters and sidewalks in a Toronto winter that does not forgive that kind of a life. And like Kirushna, he was never reported missing. Then, in April 2017, a 44-year-old Turkish immigrant named Selim Esen, who had openly struggled with addiction and was last seen around one of the busiest intersections in the country near Yonge and Bloor, he too vanished. Just a little while after that, on the 26th of June, the day after Toronto's enormous annual Pride Parade, with the streets still covered with confetti and rainbow flags, a 49-year-old white former bartender and prominent LGBTQ activist named Andrew Kinsman vanished from his apartment in Cabbagetown. This was the mistake. Andrew Kinsman was the mistake this killer made. Not because the killer changed his method. He did not. It was the same. But because for the first time in 7 years, the man he took had a community loud enough to be heard. Kinsman in particular had set off something the earlier disappearance had never set off. An alarm. Real institutional alarm. Because Kinsman, unlike the others, was a white, Canadian, well-known LGBTQ activist, and more importantly, although more ordinarily, a man with roommates and a sister and a huge web of chosen family who started reporting him missing within hours and would not stop reporting him until somebody listened. By the first week of August 2017, the Toronto police had launched a brand new task force to investigate his disappearance and Selim's as well. They called this one Project Prism. And Project Prism, unlike Project Houston, was going to find what it was looking for. The break came from inside Andrew Kinsman's apartment. When investigators searched it, they found a calendar, the kind of paper wall calendar a lot of us still keep. And on the square for the 26th of June, the exact day he had disappeared, Andrew had written in his own handwriting a single word, a first name. That name was Bruce. A first name on a calendar square with no surname and no phone number is the kind of clue that in most cases means nothing at all. But the Project Prism detectives pulled on it anyway. They went looking for video of Andrew's last hours, and from a security camera on his street, they got the footage they needed. A man matching Andrew's description climbing into a red Dodge Caravan around 3 in the afternoon. Now, this van had a distinctive band of chrome trim running down its side. A detective on the team named Dave Dickinson took that description, a red Dodge Caravan with chrome trim, and ran it against Ontario's vehicle registration records, looking for that model of van owned by any man named Bruce. In a metropolitan area of 6 million people, the search returned 5 matches. That's 1 in a million. He pulled up photographs of each of the 5 vans, eliminated 4 of them because the chrome down the side did not match the footage, and then was left with 1 name, 1 man, and 1 van. That name on the registration was Bruce McArthur, a 66-year-old self-employed landscaper. Address was in Thorncliffe Park, north of the gay village. Business name on his vehicle paperwork was Artistic Designs. And when the Project Prism detectives went back through their databases to see if this name had come up anywhere in the system before, oh boy, did it. They found it in a file that had been closed and shelved 3.5 years earlier. They found it in the case notes of their original task force, Project Houston, in the record of an interview conducted in November of 2013. This interview was with a man Project Houston had identified as a person with connections to the missing, a man who had admitted to knowing at least 2 of the disappeared, a man whose criminal record nobody had bothered to pull, a man the task force had questioned once and let walk back out into the same life. That man, that same man, was Bruce McArthur. And from the moment Project Prism detectives realized that they were holding something of value, the entire investigation tilted on its side. Because if Bruce McArthur was their man for Andrew Kinsman, then Bruce McArthur was very probably also their man for God knows how many more. But for now, what the Project Prism detectives knew was just a name, a van, and a face, and they began to watch him. The surveillance started in November of 2017. Plainclothes officers and unmarked vehicles followed his van around the city. They watched the door of his 19th floor apartment in Thorncliffe Park. They watched the homes of clients whose lawns he tended. They watched, in particular, a quiet suburban property in the Leaside neighborhood on a street called Mallory Crescent, where MacArthur had a long-standing arrangement to store his equipment and his large planters. They were piecing together a man's life 1 car ride at a time, and then in early December, the task force took a risk. They organized a covert search of MacArthur's apartment, a quiet, off-the-record entry designed to be in and out before he ever knew anybody had been inside. Officers slipped in, and they began looking. They began to find things. And then, in the middle of the search, MacArthur unexpectedly came home. It was like from the scene in Seven when Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt are in the killer's house, and the killer is back from buying groceries. The officers inside had to abandon the operation mid-step and slip out a different door. They didn't get everything they wanted, but what they had already gotten was damning. They had begun to find traces of the missing men inside the apartment of a 66-year-old Toronto landscaper. And then, with Project Prism already making progress, on the 8th of December 2017, the chief of the Toronto Police Service held a public press conference. By that point, the city's queer community had been begging openly for months for the police to admit what everyone walking down Church Street already knew: that a serial killer was operating in the village, that gay men were being hunted, much like Jeffrey Dahmer was, that something was very wrong. The chief stood at a podium in front of the cameras and addressed those exact fears. The community was wrong. The fear was unfounded, the chief said. Go home, sleep tight, he said.
But the evidence today tells us that there is not a serial killer based on.
This denial felt like a reflex, like muscle memory. It was the police service of a major western city telling a frightened minority community one more time that their experience of reality was wrong, even as the case files in the next room were saying it was right. And while the community sat with that, the surveillance teams kept watching for 6 more weeks, and then came the arrest nobody had prepared for. On the 18th of January 2018, in the deep cold of a Toronto winter, the officers watching Bruce McArthur saw a young man walk into his apartment building with him and step into the elevator. The officers by that point knew every detail of what they suspected this man of doing. They knew what was likely about to happen on the other side of the apartment door. And they made a decision on the radio in the time it takes me to read this very sentence. They didn't wait for backup or protocol. They simply went up the stairs and kicked the front door open. Inside, on MacArthur's bed, they found a man, alive, tied down, terrified. The duffel bag was open on the floor. The kit was laid out. The young man on the bed was minutes, perhaps seconds, from becoming the 9th name in the story. His identity has never been released publicly. He is simply referred to as John. He's the reason this case has somewhere in its center a single moment of pure mercy. A stranger's decision to kick down a door is the only reason that man, that John, is alive today. That evening, Bruce McArthur was placed in handcuffs in his own apartment and led out by the officers who had spent the last 6 months watching him. He looked like somebody's grandfather, and he did not resist. Inside that apartment, behind him, in the phones and the laptops and the cameras and the planters and the closets and the duffel bag next to the bed, the entire architecture of the last 7 years began, slowly, to come out into the very air it had evaded. Bruce McArthur was 66 years old on the night the officers came through that door. To the people who had ever met him in person, that arrest, when they read about it in the papers that next morning, made absolutely no sense at all. His friends in the village, of whom he had many, described him using the same handful of words: soft, kind, gentle, warm, affable, the friend who could help you move on a Saturday, the man who remembered your birthday. This man had built a small but loyal landscaping business in some of Toronto's nicer neighborhoods. Most of his clients were wealthy elderly women who adored him. He brought them flowers from his own greenhouses. He remembered their grandchildren's names. He charged less than the competition, and he showed up on time. And every December, when the cold shut his landscaping work down for the season, MacArthur put on a red Santa Claus suit and sat in a high velvet chair at a shopping mall in the city's East End, where he let children of every background, children of 100 different countries in one of the most multicultural shopping malls on earth, climb onto his lap for the photograph. There is a picture of him in that Santa suit still on the internet. His beard is real, white, full. His glasses are perched halfway down his nose in the way a kind grandfather's glasses sit. He is smiling at someone off camera, and he constantly talked about how much he loved this job where children sat on his lap. He said he loved the joy of working in a mall where the children would come and give him love. After the arrest, one of Bruce's oldest friends sat in shock with the reporter, trying to make sense of what he was being told. He said it felt as though there had been 2 people living inside one body: the man they knew and the man they were now reading about. So let me tell you about the man they were now reading about. Because the man on their newspapers had been there the whole time. They had just been looking at the other one. You see, for most of his adult life, Bruce McArthur did not live anything resembling the life he was living in that Toronto apartment. In fact, he lived in a small Ontario city called Oshawa, about an hour east of Toronto. He was married, He had 2 children, a daughter Melanie and a son Todd. He worked as a traveling salesman of socks and underwear, crisscrossing the province trying to convince department stores to carry his employer's merchandise. He went to church and was very active in it, the kind of active that fills your weekends and your weeknights and leaves no time to sit alone with yourself. By every account anyone close to him would give years later, MacArthur, in those years, was doing what closeted men in suburban mid-century North America had been doing for generations. He was running. He was running through the marriage and his job and his children and his church, away from a part of himself he just could not confront. And he was running so hard for nearly 20 years that it worked. But this running stopped working in the early 1990s because Bruce finally caved into having affairs with other men. He eventually also came out to his wife, which did not quite end the marriage, nor did it continue normally. It was in this weird stalemate. To worsen matters, the family fell into financial trouble. They mortgaged the house, and in 1999, they declared bankruptcy. By the end of that decade, MacArthur had separated from his wife and moved to downtown Toronto because there was simply no gay community to speak of in a remote town like Oshawa. And at the age of 46, he was finally going to try to live openly the life he had spent 20 years pretending he did not want. He was seeing a psychiatrist in those years. He was on Prozac. He had just come out of a long-term gay relationship that hadn't worked. And in the middle of all of that, just past noon on Halloween of 2001, something inside him broke loose. That morning, Bruce ran into an acquaintance on the street in downtown Toronto. The acquaintance was an actor and model named Mark Henderson. Henderson invited him upstairs to see his Halloween costume, and Bruce followed him into the apartment. And then somewhere in the few minutes between walking through the door and standing in Mark's living room, Bruce took an iron pipe out of his coat, a pipe he had been carrying, and he struck Henderson over the head with it. From behind, several times. Henderson fought back but lost consciousness. When he finally woke up, Bruce was gone. Mark frantically called 911 and was taken to St. Michael's Hospital, where he needed stitches across the back of his head and his fingers and 6 weeks of physiotherapy. He was traumatized so badly by the attack that years later, when Bruce was finally being held to account for everything, Henderson could not bring himself to deliver a victim impact statement. The trauma had not lifted in 20 years. For Henderson's attack, Bruce was charged with assault with a weapon and assault causing bodily harm. He pleaded guilty. The Crown obviously asked for prison time. But the judge, on the basis of a psychiatric report and a defense theory that the violence had been chemically induced, gave Bruce a lighter sentence. The psychiatric report the judge based his lighter sentencing off basically said that Bruce's actions were caused by mixing his anti-seizure medication with amyl nitrite, a recreational drug sometimes used during gay sex. And for this, they gave him house arrest, then a curfew, then probation, not jail time. He was banned from the village except for work and medical appointments. He was forbidden firearms. He was ordered into anger management counseling, but no prison. He did not serve a single day. In 2014, Bruce applied for what is called a record suspension on Mark Henderson's assault, and he was granted it. This matters. A record suspension means the conviction is administratively wiped from the systems that ordinary background checks would search. Most of the physical evidence in the case, the photographs of Henderson's injuries, the witness statements, had already been destroyed in 2010 as part of a routine police retention policy. So by the time future Toronto officers ever wanted to look back at MacArthur's history, the history had been administratively buried. He had, in the eyes of any standard search, become a man with no criminal record at all.
Aryan, this to me is absurd. This is an active, recurring wipe of information that happens periodically where you're losing all of this data on any one person's past criminal history. I feel like there have to be better ways of data storage. This is absolutely absurd.
I mean, this isn't like a developing country that does not have the infrastructure to digitize
that
information,
yeah.
whether digitize it or keep it in backrooms. I mean, one thing the American system does well is it keeps everything.
Right.
Everything. Notoriously so. However, it too has a cleaning of the data policy, but that wouldn't encompass a violent criminal history.
Right.
I mean, it could get rid of really old solved cases that have no relation, but getting rid of this data is directly related to him being able to commit more and more crimes and not being
He's a man
flagged.
that's alive. He's a man that you know will not be in the prison. He knows
Exactly.
it's a man that you've let out onto the street,
Yeah.
and yet you don't have these records on him. That's crazy.
On the other hand, if something like this happens in the US, I mean, it's not a one-to-one comparison, but you have that publicly accessible database of those
well, yeah.
of child predators, so that people can, whether or not, not even administrative reasons, but for job hiring, you can run a background check and know who
Correct.
you're working with. This man legally can be said has no history of crime. That's
Exactly.
just absurd to me. Now hold that absurdity with you for a bit, because Project Houston interviewed this man in November of 2013 and the record suspension came through in 2014. So when those Project Houston officers chose not to pull his record, that record was actually still there for them to find. They just didn't look. And Bruce McArthur did not stop. In fact, the same year as the Mark Henderson attack, while the case was still working its way through the courts, MacArthur registered on a gay fetish dating site called Recon, used overwhelmingly by men interested in BDSM. He listed his interest as submissive men. Over the next decade, he would build profiles on a long list of similar platforms: Silver Daddies, Manjam, Grindr, Bear 411, Bear Forest, Scruff, Daddy Hunt, Squirt, Crowler. These are weird names, but these are facts. He met partners through these sites. He met hookups through these sites. He rebuilt his entire social and sexual life around these apps. By the late 2000s, he was back in the village regularly, in spite of the ban from his sentence, and he had a reputation in those circles for liking, quote, rough sex. He had another reputation too: quieter, more guarded, less likely to be put into print, of being a man with a temper that, when it flipped, was frightening. In 2011, an acquaintance named Robert James stopped hanging out with him after MacArthur turned red in the face and screamed at him about a petty incident. A Toronto restaurant owner watched him fly into a sudden rage in 2013 after being caught in a small lie about his boyfriend. People who had known MacArthur for years began quietly to step back. There was nothing they could put their finger on, but just a feeling, an inkling, a sense that in the back of the brain, something inside this man wasn't sitting right. None of them ever went to the police because it never amounted to anything criminal. Most of them never even told each other. They just stopped picking up his calls. He became a persona non grata. His landscaping business, though, began to thrive. A colleague who installed water features on 3 of his projects remembered something about it that, in hindsight, reads like a screenplay. MacArthur was always accompanied on those jobs by 2 men. One was an older white man who appeared to be his romantic partner. The other was a day laborer, almost always a South Asian or Southeast Asian or Middle Eastern man. The faces of the day laborers changed, but he always had someone by his side. But turns out, MacArthur wasn't the only one people started to distance themselves from. In 2014, his son Todd was sentenced to 14 months in jail for a string of obscene phone calls to women. He was released on bail and ordered to live with his father and assist with the landscaping business. While Todd was living there, a friend of Todd's came over one night and used the bathroom. The bathroom wall was covered, top to bottom, with photographs of naked South Asian men. The friend asked Todd what he was looking at. Todd answered casually, that those were men his father knew. MacArthur made no attempt to hide it. He laughed about it the next morning at breakfast. 2 years after this, in 2016, 3 years after the Project Houston interview, while that file lay cold in a drawer and the killings continued, a man met MacArthur in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons in North Toronto for what was supposed to be a sexual encounter. They climbed into the back of MacArthur's van. And in that van, during that encounter, MacArthur put a hand around the man's throat and squeezed and did not let go. The man could not breathe. He fought free. He stumbled out of the van and dialed 911 from his own car. He'd been hurt so badly that he could not swallow properly for a week. The police came. They interviewed MacArthur. They took his account. But he was calm, articulate, persuasive. In the interrogation, he claimed the entire encounter had been consensual rough sex initiated by the other man, and that he, MacArthur, had been the one who was almost choked to death. The interviewing officer believed him, and no charge was laid. MacArthur walked out of the police station yet again, right back into that life. So this is the man we are dealing with. This is the gentle landscaper, the soft-spoken Santa Claus, the friend, the father, the practicing churchgoer, the late blooming gay man trying to start his life anew. This is also the man whose bathroom wall above his own breakfast table was openly decorated with photographs of naked brown men. This is also the man with the iron pipe in his coat in 2001 and the hand on the throat in 2016. The capacity for ordinary kindness and the capacity for the worst thing one human being can do to another, it turns out, do not cancel each other out. In some people, this juxtaposition sits quietly, side by side on the same shelf of consciousness, in the same body, and they do not interfere with each other at all. By now, in January of 2018, after police broke down MacArthur's door and saved the ninth victim, both those sides that lived within him were finally revealed to the community that needed answers. The morning after the arrest, police officers arrived at the front door of a quiet home in the Leaside neighborhood of Toronto on a street called Mallory Crescent. The home belonged to a woman named Karen Fraser and her husband. The officers came with a warrant. They gave Karen Fraser 20 minutes to leave her own home. They brought in cadaver dogs. Karen Fraser had known Bruce McArthur for years. He was her gardener. The arrangement was friendly and casual. He could store his equipment and his large heavy planters on her property, and in exchange, he kept her lawn nice. Pretty simple, isn't it? For years, large heavy planters had been coming and going from her backyard. Some of them had been there long enough that the flowers in them had bloomed across multiple seasons. She had thought she had a polite, hard-working landscaper with an oddly large collection of flower pots, and so she had been grateful. But it is exactly those planters that the police's cadaver dogs led them to. And inside those planters was the answer to the question, where have these men gone? Because inside the planters were the dismembered remains of 7 human beings. The 8th victim, Hamid Kayan, would be recovered months later in the summer of 2018 from the ravine that ran along the back of the same property. Police actually searched dozens of other properties connected to MacArthur's landscaping business in some of the wealthier corners of Toronto, but the bodies were all in one backyard. He had been burying men in a stranger's garden and then going back across the lawn to mow it. The remains were identified, one by one, through the spring of 2018, but because some of the men had been dead for nearly 8 years, the work was slow. Of the 7 men buried there, Kirushna Kumar Kangaratnam, the 37-year-old Tamil who had survived a civil war and a 3-month voyage across the Pacific, had nobody who reported him missing. So he was identified only after police took the rare and painful step of releasing a photograph of his face after death and asking the public for help. Over 500 tips came in. His family in Sri Lanka learned what had happened to him from across an ocean. Then there was Andrew Kinsman, the 49-year-old LGBTQ activist, the man whose enormous web of love is the only reason any of the others ever got justice. His sister Patricia said something at the sentencing that stayed with me. She said that the family does not say the name of the man who took him. She said simply, "We don't say his name." Inside MacArthur's apartment, investigators seized everything that could store information: phones, laptops, desktop computers, cameras, hard drives, USB drives, and on them, they found thousands of photographs. Because you see, MacArthur had the odd habit of photographing his victims, each and every one of them. Some of the photographs had been taken while the men were still alive. Others had been taken after they were dead. The ones taken after were staged. He had dressed his victims in death in the same fur coat, the same black leather hat. He had sometimes placed an unlit cigar between their lips. In some of the photographs, the murder weapon is still visible, a metal bar with a piece of rope tied to it, designed to be tightened around the neck by twisting the bar. He returned to these photographs long after the killings. They were a thing he kept, a thing he went back to, something called euphoric reminiscing. He had another odd habit. He shaved the facial hair from several of his victims, most of whom, in fact, had been chosen for their very beards, and stored those hair in zip-sealed plastic bags in a shed. He kept their jewelry, a bracelet that had belonged to Skanda, pieces that had belonged to Dean. In his bedroom, in a duffel bag right next to the bed, officers found duct tape, a surgical glove, rope, zip ties, a bungee cord, and syringes. The kit, the contents of a man who had done this many times and was prepared to do it many more. With nowhere else to run, Bruce McArthur pleaded guilty to all 8 counts of his first-degree murders. He said the word guilty quietly, once into the microphone, as the registrar read out each of the 8 names. He offered no explanations. He has, to this day, offered no explanation. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of applying for parole for 25 years. He'll be 91 years old at his first theoretical opportunity for release. He will most likely die in prison. You could end the story here. The killer is caught, he's convicted, and locked away forever. If we end it there, we let the most important part of the story off the hook. And I'm not willing to do that. Because after the arrest, the rage that had been building in Toronto's queer and immigrant communities for years finally had somewhere to go. The push for accountability was led in large part by a South Asian organization called the Alliance for South Asian AIDS Prevention and by a man named Haran Vijayanathan, who had spent the worst weeks of the case standing beside the friends and the families of the dead. They demanded an independent review of how the police had handled the disappearances. Not an internal one where the police investigate themselves and announce they did nothing wrong. A real outside reckoning. And they got it. A retired Ontario judge named Gloria Epstein was appointed to lead it. The work took 3 years. The final report, released in April of 2021, ran over 1,000 pages. They titled this report aptly, Missing and Missed. It made 151 recommendations. Its central finding was that Toronto's police system had failed, not just in the case, but systemically, to investigate disappearances of marginalized people with anything like the seriousness it brought to the disappearances of the unmarginalized ones. The report found that LGBTQ people, sex workers, migrants, drug users, the poor, the indigenous, had been over-policed, under-serviced, and discriminated against. Whether the recommendations of the missing and missed report ever make it into jurisprudence is only something time will tell. But for now, we have a serial killer sitting in prison, who's also the same man that went out distributing missing person flyers for one of his own victims. We have a serial killer in prison who used to bring flowers to an elderly woman, who used to still go back to his planters in the spring to plant something pretty over the top. This is the absurd case of Bruce McArthur and the 8 men he tried to erase: Skanda, Basir, Hamid, Surush, Kirushna, Dean, Selim, Andrew. Say their names if you can, because they deserve them.
If you like what we do here at Desi Studios and absolutely love what we're wearing today, this is merch you can go buy all for yourself.
You can buy this Desi Crime merch in our YouTube store on the link down below at Karak Merch. Keep the engines at Desi Studios rolling so we can pay our videographer right behind the camera to make these amazing episodes just for you.